Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special Splice event. This is something that we're doing for the first time in partnership with Reuters Institute around the global news report that all of you, I'm sure, at this point would have read. We are joined by a fantastic panel of speakers today. We have Nic Newman, who obviously wrote the report at Reuters Institute, which we'll add the link to at the bottom of the in the description below. We also have Miriam Grace Go, who works at Rappler. We also have Ying Chan, formerly of HKU. We also have Rishad Patel, my co-founder here at Splice. We are very excited about where this conversation is going, just because the new trends that have come up in this space over the last couple of years have been fantastic and really interesting. But very quickly, I would invite our guests to quickly introduce yourselves. Nic?
Hi, yeah, really good to be here, Alan. Thanks for doing this. So my name is Nic Newman. I'm the lead author of the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, University of Oxford. I've been doing this since 2012. Before that, I was a journalist, mainly with the BBC Radio Television, and I was part of the founding team of the BBC News website in 1997. So you might say a digital veteran.
Credentials, very good. And Miriam, I understand that, well, first of all, you work at Rappler, and secondly, you are heading up to Reuters Institute to do a fellowship there. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. I'm the news editor of Rappler, the pioneering social news network in the Philippines. Before Rappler, I was with Newsbreak. It's an investigative team that was eventually absorbed by Rappler. So I supervise the reporters in their daily work, and I also set the news agenda.
Wonderful. And Ying Chan, which I'm sure all of you know, Ying and I met when she was still at HKU. What have you been up to recently?
Well, I'm still at HKU. I've retired from day-to-day teaching. I'm doing some consulting here on digital transformation. And then separately, I work on journalism projects, trying to
Wonderful.
get back into the work.
It's hard to walk away from it, isn't it, Ying?
Absolutely.
And since we have Miriam and Rappler represented today here, we probably shouldn't start this before we talk a little bit about Rappler and, of course, the issues at hand at Rappler with Miriam Grace's case. Miriam, very quickly, can we, all of us around the world have been looking at what's going on at Rappler, and all of us are obviously very concerned about what this means for the future of media in the Philippines. Can you quickly, get us up to speed around, what the core issues are, if you could frame that for a wider global audience, but also to tell us, as an industry, what can we do to support Rappler in a time like this?
A couple of Mondays ago, a local court in Manila handed a verdict that Maria and our former researcher Ray Santos were guilty of cyber libel. This is over a story that's 8 years old. The story was mainly about the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who at that time was going through an impeachment trial. And in the story, we mentioned a businessman who was being investigated confidentially by certain law enforcement agencies for some of his business activities. And we pointed out how come he was providing expensive vehicles to the sitting Supreme Court justice. This article was published months before the Philippine Congress passed a cybercrime law. So, but we were being sued for libel because under the cybercrime law. So, the prescription period for libel in the Philippines is 1 year. So, if you look at it, if the businessman who was complaining didn't file a complaint in 2013, the case should not have been entertained by prosecutors in the first place. But in fact, a panel of prosecutors, of investigators in government already dismissed it outright, but their higher ups in the Justice Department decided to pick up the case again. This was in, and they said that the cybercrime law is a special law, so it's not covered by the penal code that sets a prescription period of 1 year. So they said that there's actually a much older law that says the prescription period for libel is 12 years. So they are saying that the article is still covered. What makes us worried about the decision is its implications on how journalists are going to do their job from here on. Because in the ruling, the judge is practically saying that if you do not reveal who your sources are, then you're likely that your story is not credible, or if you get hold of a confidential document from governments or an intelligence report, the burden to actually investigate the veracity of allegations in that confidential report is on the journalist. This is like an intelligence report by government officials who are investigating somebody, but the burden to prove the wrongdoing is not on the government investigators, but on the journalist who is citing that document. This week, I pushed out a newsletter enumerating some of the things that reporters are foreseeing would become a problem if this decision becomes a doctrine from here on. We're appealing the case, so hopefully this will be overturned by the higher courts. But if not, it's a problem for investigative journalists from here on. Just last night we were on a call with several investigative groups around the world, and they are saying that if Rappler is being constrained from doing its usual investigative work, they could help out. They could help out pursue some of the things, the documents, the personalities that we want to investigate from the Philippines.
Right, and what can we do as an industry to stand behind Rappler at this point?
Definitely, the immediate need is for the industry to have a common stand, to be of like mind that this is an attack on press freedom, and because the strategy of the other camp is always to try to divide the media and to isolate Rappler, to say that this is just about Rappler, this is just about the supposedly not responsible conduct of a journalist, and this has nothing to do with the rest of them. So unfortunately, there are some media practitioners who are actually taking that side. And a division is the last thing that the industry would need right now, because really, the journalists should realize that if Rappler is taken down, the next media organization would be the target. So.
Right, I can imagine the amount of stress that the entire team is feeling right now. So please, send our regards. All right, let's go to Nic. Nic, if you can present your slides right now, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'm just going to share these slides here. Hopefully you can see that. Yes?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. So I'm going to spend just 20 minutes or so outlining some of the main findings in our digital news report. And I'll talk about the impact of coronavirus in general, and also about changing business models, some of the acceleration that we're seeing in changing business models as a result. I'll talk about trust and misinformation, which is critical all across the region and across the world. I'll look specifically at some of the data from Asia, how the story is different, but also where we see similarities with other parts of the world. And just for some context, this is our 9th digital news report, so covering 80,000 respondents, 40 markets, and as we've mentioned, in the Philippines for the first time as part of extending our global mission. Just a reminder before we start on the methodology, so it is based on an online poll So it is representative of people who are online, and as such, it will tend to slightly underrepresent traditional news behaviors, such as television, print, and radio, and particularly in countries with lower internet penetration, and many of those are in Asia. So it's worth bearing that in mind when we're thinking about comparing countries. Polling was conducted on our behalf by YouGov, and these are robust samples of around 2,000 in each market. And there's just a list here of the various supporters of the study. It's an independent study. We have Google, we have broadcasters like the BBC, we have regulators, academic institutions. So in total, 15 different organizations sponsoring what we do. And I should make clear at the outset, the survey was conducted in January and February, so coronavirus was underway, but before lockdowns in many countries. But we did do a second survey in April in 6 countries, including South Korea in the Asia region, to understand the impact, which has obviously been considerable on the business side, but also in terms of consumer behavior. There are the Asian countries. So in terms of coronavirus, much of the impact is already well documented, but it's important to note. So we did see initially very significant increases in the use of television news. So in many countries, television is still the most trusted form of media. And so in line with previous research, when there's a bit of a crisis, people really turn to television. You can see that in the UK, up 16 percentage points between our poll in January and our poll in April. But if we look across the 6 countries, and I say this includes South Korea, you can see that pretty much everything was up. People were just much more interested in the news. Television was up, online was up, social media was up, and the main casualty was print. So the problems of physical distribution means many publishers stop publishing, and many may never resume publishing. So this is really going to accelerate the decline of print and the move to digital. In terms of online impacts, so this is actually just looking at the UK. There's some data that we referenced in the report from the BBC, and it shows you effectively the doubling of interest. So daily browsers doubling within a few days at the start of the crisis. And again, it shows this point that people at times of crisis really turn to reliable and trusted brands. When it's a matter of life and death, people really do that. Before, the traffic has fallen back to a certain extent, but still higher than it was before the crisis started. And many trusted commercial websites have shown very similar effects during this crisis. And then, of course, we've all learned a whole load of new digital habits. So we're on a video call right now, and we've seen those video networks growing almost into other social networks, and people are using them for business, but they're also using them to communicate and to support each other over COVID-19, as you can see here, 10%. So they were regularly accessing some of these new video platforms, people using Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups, often for the first time. And I think many of these behaviors are going to survive and will be a real legacy of coronavirus, again, accelerating the trends towards digital. And particularly, we've seen acceleration of trends towards paying for news, donation models as a result of coronavirus as well. And that's partly because of the weakness of advertising, because of the sort of impending recession is going to push more publishers, we think, into paid models or hybrid models, more diversified business models. This is our data. Again, reminder, this is just from January before coronavirus, and it already shows significant increases in the percentage of people who are paying for some kind of online news. It is focused on a few areas. The United States up 4 percentage points to 20%, and some European countries have been doing this for a very long time in the Nordic regions, but we also see increases in some Asian countries and Latin America too, as more publishers in Hong Kong, for example, have been asking people to pay for news, often for the first time. This year, we did a more detailed study in a few countries to find out which brands people were subscribing to. And we find that in this world of paying, actually you tend to get a few big winners. So in the UK, not many people are paying, but it's essentially the Times of London Telegraph. In the US, as you know, it's the New York Times, Washington Post. So about half of all the subscriptions just go to those 2 publications. In Norway, you have various national papers, but you also, interestingly, have people paying for local papers. 130 different local papers. We don't see that in many other parts of the world. In this detailed study, we also looked in more detail at why people subscribe and why they don't subscribe. And the most important reason is that online, they are going to get something that is different, that is distinctive. People feel they're getting something they can't get for free. So that's the main reason. Price is incredibly important to many. So maybe people are offered special deals, as in this case, the bundling of the Washington Post and Amazon Prime. And then really interesting is this idea of supporting journalism. You know, journalism is under threat in many parts of the world, as we just heard, in the Philippines. And in the US, over half say it's a really key factor. So supporting the mission of journalists, holding people to account, is really something I think publishers can build on. And that may be because journalism's under threat because of political attacks, or it may be because of the economics of local news or whatever, that it's something that needs to be supported right now. And this is something that many publishers are trying to build on. What might encourage people, more people to pay more valuable content? Ad-free content is another factor that many publishers are trying to entice people into more of a paying relationship. Price, so in many cases, people see online news as too expensive. Sometimes they just want more flexibility, like with Netflix or Spotify. You often get family subscriptions, and the news industry doesn't really offer a lot of that flexibility. But in many countries, UK and US especially, around half say that nothing could persuade them to pay. So for many people, free content is good enough. Free content is obviously going to continue, ad-supported content. If not from publishers, then from social media or aggregators or other sites. People saying that there's nothing they can't get from some of these mobile aggregators, for example. And then I think really interesting is in the wake of coronavirus, we're also seeing other models emerging. So donation models and membership models emerging across the world. So some here, digital-born outlets like Vox in the US, for example, have started to ask for contributions and linking the need to support them to the crisis directly. You also have small local news brands here, investigative outlets like Bellingcat, which does open source investigations now. And donations are becoming an increasingly important part of what they do. Still a relatively small number, but I think we're going to see this really as a growing trend over the next few years. So if business models are going to move more to more direct relationships, more direct payment, then the issue of trust is going to be critical. And we know that during the coronavirus crisis, trust in the media went up in many countries because that moment of sort of national solidarity. But we also know in the UK, for example, where we've been polling every week, that trust went down again just as soon as normal politics resumed, which it has done. And in our year-on-year tracking data, again, reminder, this is from January, we see that across countries, we've seen a further alarming fall in trust over the previous year. So just 38% say they trust most news most of the time. So that's a bit higher in the brands people are using themselves, so 46%, but again, lower than it was a year ago, and lower still in distributed environments like search and social, where information tends to be much more unreliable. If we look at the full set of countries and markets, we typically find trust tends to be highest in Northern European countries like Finland, but I've actually picked out the Asian countries here in orange, and you can see that trust overall tends to be much lower in parts of Asia, and it's also fallen in many of these markets. So down, for example, 6 in Singapore, 6 in Australia, down 16 percentage points in Hong Kong, where of course we've had protests over the extradition bill and other issues, down 6 in Malaysia, 4 in Taiwan, and then South Korea traditionally in our poll has some of the lowest trust of all. People feel that the journalism is not sufficiently robust or independent of government or business. And for the first time in the Philippines, 27%. So we don't have any comparators with where it was last year, but trust is extremely low, with often going hand in hand with sort of polarized media. Just to make clear, you're not alone in Asia. We've had, as you may know, an incredibly divisive year in the UK with an election and Brexit. And again, we've seen trust in the UK fall from 50% to 28% in 5 years. So in many of these countries, what we're seeing is it's not journalism getting worse, it's that society is getting more divided. And the media is being drawn into many of these conflicts on one side or the other, and is perceived as representing one side or the other. And that is affecting much of the trust. And it'd be interesting to hear more about the Philippines and how that works in Hong Kong as well. So moving on to the questions of misinformation, and overall, still alarmingly high levels. So 56% say they find it hard to know what to believe online when it comes to news. And this year we've been asking respondents, why that is. What are they most concerned about? And really interestingly, in terms of content, people are most concerned about domestic politicians. More true in the Philippines about the behavior of domestic politicians, Malaysia. In other countries, it's a little bit more about activists in Hong Kong. So people are concerned about the behavior of activists as well as politicians. In other countries, about journalists. And in Japan and Taiwan, Japan is the only country, I think, where people are more concerned about the behavior of ordinary people spreading misinformation than they are about the behavior of their own politicians. So quite interesting regional differences there in terms of who people blame, if you like, for misinformation. People are concerned about it, but they blame, that's the content. In terms of the channels of misinformation, on average across countries, people have highest level of concern about Facebook, followed by messaging apps like WhatsApp, followed by search, and then YouTube and Twitter, though again, we see a lot of variations by country. And in some parts of the world, WhatsApp is seen as a much bigger problem, partly because of the closed messaging environments. So in Malaysia, for example, Brazil, Mexico, and Chile, people are more concerned about WhatsApp than they are about Facebook. In the Philippines, it's all about Facebook, and I'm sure we'll hear more about the role that Facebook plays there in spreading misinformation. There was a new question this year about video consumption, which I thought was particularly interesting, especially in terms of the Asia region. So we asked people whether their core preference was for reading online or for watching online or for listening to news online. And we see some really interesting regional differences here. So generally in Northern Europe, we have very strong reading traditions for brands that have really stressed the text and the pictures as opposed to video. So a lot of the investments have gone into text and pictures. And we see significantly more people who say they prefer to read news than watch news. In Asia and North America, it's a bit more mixed. So you can see here, almost 4 in 10 say that, their core underlying preference is to watch news. And obviously, many Asian countries, television's been very important, but as television declines, how is that going to affect media going forward? There's quite a lot of regional variation in there. So, in the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, video online is particularly strong, whereas video online is much less important in Japan and Singapore. So even within the region, there are significant differences, but I thought it was an interesting trend to bring out in this discussion. And then just to give you an example of how different things are between Hong Kong and the UK, say, here, this graph basically shows that video is mainly consumed in Hong Kong, not via news sites, though many people do consume them on news sites, but through social platforms like Facebook and YouTube. So 76% of the video that's consumed in Hong Kong is consumed via those external platforms. Whereas in the UK, there is very little distribution of news via those social platforms. So most of the news is consumed, video news is consumed on news websites or not at all. So many people in the UK are not consuming video news. So I think these are really interesting differences. It'd be interesting to get your take on this. And over time, will we see even more of a shift from text to video online? And what does that mean for the quality of our news, the way in which it represents faithfully what people need to know? So just moving on briefly to platforms, a little bit more information about the different kinds of platforms that we see generally and across the region. So this is a chart which just shows how things have changed in terms of social networks across 12 countries we've been tracking since 2014. And you can clearly see that change over time, the growing importance of WhatsApp in many parts of the world. So 17% to 48. Facebook's been pretty level. YouTube's becoming more important. Instagram across the world becoming more important. And Facebook in general reaches 85% in some countries in Asia, up to 90% are touching a Facebook product weekly. And then for news specifically, you see Facebook. So this is a question we ask about, do you use these networks for accessing news, discovering it, sharing it, consuming it? And you can see Facebook becoming more important up to 2016. And then you had those algorithm changes, which meant Facebook became a little less important. But again, you see the rise of WhatsApp, and Instagram has become globally now the fastest growing network, almost as important as Twitter for news. And we've really seen that with coronavirus, climate change coverage, Black Lives Matter, some of these sort of big issues that really appeal to younger people. Instagram has become an absolute center of a lot of that in some countries. Just looking specifically at the Asia region, we see an incredibly varied picture, more varied than in many other parts of the world. So, for example, top left, you've got Japan is the only country in our survey where Facebook is not in the top 3. So you have Line, you have Twitter, and you have YouTube are more important, but generally people are not using social media so much in Japan. Line is important in Taiwan. In Singapore, it's WhatsApp and Facebook together are the two most important, with YouTube following that. South Korea has its own networks, Kakao, and other local networks as well. But YouTube is where we've seen the biggest growth over the last couple of years in South Korea, which is interesting. Philippines is all about Facebook. We kind of mentioned that before. I think probably the highest use of Facebook for news anywhere in the world. I can't be sure about that, but I'm pretty sure. YouTube, and again, that Facebook Messenger in combination with Facebook. So there's not much WhatsApp going on there. In Malaysia, WhatsApp and Facebook. In Australia, so Facebook is important in most of these countries. So why does this matter? Because social media is really disrupting the gateways to news, how we find news stories. And this is a chart where we ask about preferences in terms of how do you access news. So where do you start? Do you start with a news website or an app? Do you start with social media? Do you start with search, or mobile alerts, or email? And in general, every year we see more people accessing via social media, via these sort of side doors. And that makes it harder for publishers to really build those direct connections. Those are averages. And what's interesting is looking at how that works across different countries. Because in some countries, like the Nordic countries I talked about before, you have still these very strong direct connections. So 63% say they prefer to start with a news website or app when they're looking for news. So search and social media are much less important. The second model that we found, group of countries, are countries we've typified as mainly social. So I put Malaysia in that case. And here, 4 in 10 say they prefer to start with social media. So most people don't go directly to a news website. They prefer to start through social media. This obviously makes it much harder to charge for news or to build those direct relationships. Countries like the US is a bit more pick and mix, maybe older people going directly, younger people using some of these new channels like social media. And then you have a couple of exceptions, most of them in the Asian region, which we call deeply aggregated. So here you have these big portals or aggregators like Daum and Naver in South Korea, and people are accessing through these portals, search and aggregators, Yahoo in Japan and Taiwan, and publishers again need to really work through them to find audiences. So I think this is a really interesting, particularly in Asia, this is a really interesting difference, and makes it very hard to sort of take a Nordic model and say this is how you do it in parts of Asia, because the sort of core preferences that have been laid down are so very different. So just finally, given those continuing trends around the importance of aggregators and social media, I wanted to finish with a counter trend that we see in terms of how publishers are trying to build editorially curated formats, if you like, as a way of distinguishing what publishers do, but also building more direct connections and countering the platform effect. So this year we've done a big focus on email news, and overall across countries, it's still a relatively small number, but a very important in the news ecosystem. So these are people who are more interested in news. They tend to be older, but they are 60% of them are now getting these daily news updates. So they're either about politics or general news. An example would be the New York Times, The Morning, which has recently been relaunched with this idea of editorial curation. And they say it's now pretty much the biggest access point for their journalism that they have. 17 million subscribers getting an email. And so they've appointed a really senior journalist to almost guide and curate people through the day. During the coronavirus crisis, we've also had pop-up briefings around coronavirus, and of course publishers are using this to build habit and to, particularly for subscription publications, to build new subscribers as well, and to start relationships. And it's a similar story with news podcasts. So again, this is a curated format. In this case, it really connects with younger audiences. And again, we've seen more year-on-year growth in podcasts generally this year. And despite sort of some disruption during coronavirus, news has actually been one of the categories that has done best, with a whole load of, again, pop-up coronavirus newscasts, including one here featuring an epidemiologist in Germany, which went straight to the top of the chart. So podcasts are really interesting, partly because they're attracting younger people, but also because they're building a deeper connection. You're spending quite a lot of time with them. 50% say podcasts give a deeper understanding of issues than other types of media. So just to sort of recap on the sort of main points of this year's survey. So coronavirus has obviously increased demand for news. It's still at record levels in many cases, but it's also made the economics much more uncertain, definitely for ad-supported media, and that will have a knock-on effect for the ability of publishers to be watchdogs and to be independent and to hold powerful people to account. It's also likely to shift, to accelerate that shift towards more people subscribing or donating to news publishers. That won't work for all, and it will be more difficult in some countries than in others. Trust remains a significant problem, with partisanship a key factor, along with misinformation, where most people are concerned about the behavior of domestic politicians, but a substantial minority also blame social media, and some blame journalists as well. And then finally, for my little ray of hope, that editorially curated products, I think, are going to be increasingly important part of the armory, both in attracting people in the first place, but also building relationships over time. So hopefully some useful information to set up a discussion and to set out some of the data in Asia particularly, and I'm looking forward to the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Wow, Nic, thank you so much for that. It makes me think that we're seeing a redefinition, not just how people consume news, but also what news itself means in a lot of these regions. Miriam and Ying, I have a sort of question for you. What a year for the Philippines to be making its debut in the report, obviously. And it strikes me that you represent two of the countries that in Asia that have the highest reader revenue, people paying for online news. In the Philippines, it's 19%, and in Hong Kong, it's 29%. Do you feel that this has something to do with innovative products or new platforms, or are people buying into your mission?
In the case of Rappler, we launched our crowdfunding efforts and our membership program at the height of government attacks on the newsroom, and this is how our loyal readers saw a way to support us more directly, because a lot of our readers also are, a lot of our followers are not like young people who are digital natives, so they're usually not on Facebook, and they just know about the website, so they want less of the noise, but they want to hear more from Rappler. So this is the way they support us. It's the younger readers of Rappler who are actively online defending us or sharing our news content. But yeah, it's tapping a loyal readership that's already there.
For Hong Kong, I found the numbers interesting. We got 29% of the readers pay for news, and it was a spike of a 12% from the year before. And that should make Hong Kong proud because we support the news. The reason is we need to take a more deep dive into it, but then just guessing, because the traditional media in Hong Kong is very polarized. You have the pro-Beijing camp, you have the traditional camp, and you also have corporate ownership, corporates being close to Beijing. So it's very polarized. And then against this background, you have an explosion of smaller, more independent media, and to give a voice to all the others and to produce more independent news among all the established and traditional media. And people have been very aggressive in promoting readership, promoting subscription and support. And because the market in Hong Kong is very small, the ad market is very limited. You can't depend on ad market. And the traditional media, many of them survive for some reasons. Maybe their political support, and they support to have a seat at the table. So maybe that's why. But I found it very interesting.
I'm very interested in how you're seeing some of these play out, Ying. I think one of the hardest things about media is how to brand it and how to market it. Have you seen a change in the narrative over time when some of these smaller news agencies are asking for money? Do they all have the same narrative, or have you seen any kind of distinction between them?
I think there's some distinction. In your list, we see some by independent media who has risen in the ranking of your top brand. Some didn't make it, but some did make it, and that's impressive. And I think there will be a shakeout. I don't think it's sustainable, even with the support of subscription and membership. Some media, especially smaller ones, are working on diversity. You need diverse sources of income. So in addition to subscriptions and membership, you do events. I think there will be more events now. We're more opening up post COVID-19 as we come out of COVID. I think the jury is still out. Independent media is still very, very vulnerable. And to be more sustainable and to improve the product, we need to work a lot on the business side and on marketing and on developing a viable publication strategy. And a lot of work needs to be done.
I like what you're saying about events, Ying. In fact, Miriam, that leads me to my question for you. Do you see that news and media products have now started to diversify? I mean, you guys at Rappler are so strong with data. You're so strong with analytics. You look at trends. You have such a wide offering. I mean, we've seen people do not just events, but, Slack channels. People do, commenting is a media product unto itself. For example, there are micro events. Obviously, everybody's going online. How do you see productization happening for the news offering?
We've actually done some of the diversifying of products and services. We've been doing a lot of webinars even before the coronavirus lockdown started. We have newsletters daily. We have also combinations of newsletters, and we produce exclusive products like academic research papers for paying members, things like that. The strength of Rappler is that it has a very flexible and agile team. I don't know if it's a surprise for some people that our social media team, for example, our data team is almost as large as the editorial, the reportorial team. So what we do is we devise certain products and services that are unique to the times. And then when there are opportunities coming up, the people at Rappler would easily adjust to, okay, you're needed here, or I think we have to tweak this product here, so this is where the team goes. It's a very agile team actually, and mostly young people.
But I think the challenge is that for the news media, your core product is still the news. And the past year has been such a busy news year, right? With the protests, with the extradition bill last year. And then for the first part of this year, we have COVID, right? And so you need to pay all your attention to it. And now we're bracing for the national security legislation. And so it is such an important news agenda. So I think for the media is tough. You can't do too many things, and you need to work on your core product, which is news, and you have to deliver what's credible, what's accurate. You got to win over your readers. Right?
But there's always room to be able to present that core product in various ways to various audiences. And that's the exciting thing, I guess.
Right. I mean, just to pick up on what Ying was saying there, I think, we've been talking to quite a few publishers after the report, and this idea of focus, I think, is key. You really need to be clear about what your core is. And then you're building out on top of that some of these diversification with commercial teams who could look at, many publishers are looking at, as well as events, which you talk about. They're also trying to get, say, foundation funding. They're looking at diverse routes, maybe adding sticky content like puzzles, things that can cross-subsidize that journalism that can be done by different groups of people. And, it's a really hard road, but it is about that it's about, on the one hand, the focus on the brand and what you stand for, and then building out from that 2 or 3 things that really add value and stickiness.
But I think you also diversify your news product. So it's not just print, it's not just online. You deliver through cartoon, you deliver via podcast. So what I call it, your chicken stock is there, your good stuff. You did the reporting, right? You did the writing, the narrative, right? Then you repurpose it so many ways and try to get more revenues from different sources. So
right, and I think that hasn't been happening. Essentially, digital has been about sort of text and pictures, and what we've learned is that doesn't give you enough time to build those relationships and to build sustainable commercial on its own. So I think this new format development is going to be utterly critical, whether that's video, whether it's podcasts, whether it's sort of events, whole packages that give you that deeper connection, in addition to the sort of core news stuff at your heart.
Yeah, and speaking of formats, I was kind of noticing the absence of TikTok in your survey of social
Right.
media. At what point do you think TikTok will be something that you would have to add to that data?
We have it, and we've been monitoring it for 2 years, more than 2 years, and it's mainly focused obviously on 18 to 24s in most part of the world, but we monitored it also in the COVID time. And what was really interesting was to see it emerging with 18 to 24s as a source of news around COVID-19. So in some countries, around 10, 11% of 18 to 24s said they were accessing COVID news. Now, it obviously wasn't the whole way they were getting their COVID news, but we've all seen the videos of people washing their hands, doctors washing their hands in whatever, the Philippines or Malaysia, or which country it was. But so yes, TikTok is because I'd originally written it off completely. I said this has no relevance to news, but I'm having to eat my words, of course.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about TikTok is that this is, 18 to 24 is a crucial age group, just because in many countries this is the first voting experience that most of them will have. So this is where you see a new emergence of a new generation of voters. So what happens on TikTok is I think absolutely important, and increasingly becoming more mainstream. Sorry, Ying, I cut you off there. Please.
No, I just want to add in I want to ask Nic about how about Telegram. It becomes a very important tool for communication and for getting the news last year in Hong Kong, and I think it still does.
Yeah, no, it's in the report, and we list the top 6. I think Telegram's in the top 6 in Hong Kong, and not in many other countries actually. And Signal. So there are a few others as well, but the main ones. It's worth remembering, even if we use Telegram. Looking across the whole range, it's still amazingly it's Facebook and WhatsApp in some countries.
Nic, considering that, I just wanted to, I can't help thinking about what you said, that most of this report was the data collation was done in mainly January, was it? I can't help thinking that next year's report is going to be devastatingly different. I don't know. Do you have some sense of what that's going to be? Because that's going to be the real coronavirus news report.
I think yes and no. So I think, Ying was talking about fallout, right? And I think we're going to see fallout. So on the supply side, definitely. I think in terms of, ongoing structural change, it's really acceleration. So, the core changes that we've seen, sort of more platform dominated, more mobile, more digital, I think this is just going to accelerate that. And obviously you're already seeing that with sort of print disappearing in some cases, or being slimmed back, or real focus on digital strategies by publishers. So I agree, it's going to be really interesting to see how that falls out. But I always overestimate. You always overestimate what's going to happen in 1 year. But I think this is a seismic event. It's going to have a really significant impact on the media. It's going to move us from an era where we've been trying to all do mass media, something for everything, into really embracing the possibilities of digital, to deeper connections with smaller groups of people. And yes, there'll still be some big, television providers or public service providers trying to do something for everybody, but media cannot continue as it has been, and coronavirus is the kick that maybe we've needed.
Right, and if I could ask Miriam a question about the impact of COVID on the Philippine media industry. I mean, a lot of the attention has been around press freedom, with ABS-CBN and with Rappler. But in terms of consumer trends, consumer habits, what have you noticed about media trends in the Philippines?
Definitely, a lot of people moved online for consuming news about the pandemic. But I understand that in the Reuters survey, there's one graph that the pro Duterte supporters and the Rappler critics have been feasting on, about trust, the low trust on traditional media. But I think that we were all navigating this because the Philippines is one country where the primary source of news among people is really broadcast. So it's TV and radio, and print and online is really like single digits every time you do a survey. And then everybody all of a sudden moved to to online. And you will see that in all the outlets that were included in the survey, all of those news outlets have mother outlets in the traditional form. Like they are the online version of a TV station, they are the online version of a newspaper or a tabloid. And Rappler is the only one that's purely online. So if you will tell people about, if you will ask people about which brand they trust, they may be coming from the perspective that it's not that I trust this more because I discovered this online, but I trust the brand because I've seen this on TV or I've read the newspaper for many years. But definitely everyone's online, and it's also a pattern in the Philippines, and I'm not sure in other countries, but every time there's a disaster or an emergency, people really start going, even people who share disinformation or fake news, who will usually share from unreliable sites. When you have a typhoon and you have a pandemic or a health scare, they would all go to the traditional media outlets. So, and then when things die down, things settle, like what people think is happening now because we've lifted the lockdown, they go back to their old habits.
It's a great point, Miriam. We see that all over the world, and it's this sort of trust takes a long time to build up. We have these sort of long allegiances, and so when you ask about trust, that kind of kicks in quite often. And we see, amazing digital-born brands all over the world that have inexplicably low trust scores because they haven't yet built up that sort of reputation over time, which is kind of where trust comes from in many ways.
Yeah, and I thought that was quite interesting in your data, Nic. How trust is so low in so many of these Asian countries at the end of that scale there, Korea, for example, Taiwan, for example. What is that correlation between trust and credibility? Do you see the two to be interrelated or not from a data perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reasons are different in different countries, but fundamentally it comes back to, do people feel that the media is sufficiently independent? And going back to our earlier conversation about some of the lines that really resonated, is this need for the gap is for independent media, right? The question is, how do you fund that? Because so much media in parts of Asia, but actually in parts of Latin America, Africa, are nominally independent, but they're dependent on government advertising, or so there's a whole load of sort of subtle things which go in there, which people recognize and understand. And I think what online has done is provided that opportunity for independent media to emerge. And I think some of the new business models that Miriam was talking about in terms of donations and foundations and other ways in which you can get that more diverse and different way of funding media, I think is one of the exciting things that we're seeing right now across the world.
I mean, that is exactly what we're seeing even at Splice, Alan and I. We're seeing the emergence of just such a seeding of ideas for young media startups to make their way in this space right now. This has afforded them this massive opportunity. You have low costs, you have a ton of free tools and ideas. We like to call it the golden age of media, and perhaps more so now. Within all of this, I think there is an opportunity for independent media to rise. But as you said, Miriam and Ying, I mean, there are different reasons for this to happen in different regions, and Nic said that there are different reasons for this to happen across the world with relation to trust and credibility, right? Do you feel that you're seeing, Ying, even at HKU, with your students? Are you seeing a sense of opportunity? Are you seeing a sense of what's the next generation looking like with your students?
Well, as you said, there are a lot of opportunities. People want information, they need information, right? But what is lacking, I guess, in Asia is support for the startups you talk about. It's very exciting. Like, where are the foundations, local foundations that support media? Where are our philanthropists that would support the news media, right? And so, like, you did a great job in giving out funds from, is it Facebook or Google? One of them, right? They are all giving out money. But hey, where are the platforms here in Asia? I think that is lacking. And I think for the long time, we still have the what we call non-profit news, right? They need to brush up their business models. They need to market their product, not like traditional nonprofits, right, that live on Hangouts. But then they need a bridge to help them. They need a crutch to help them to get up to speed. Where are they? Okay. And I think that is a glaring hole in developing Asian media. So opportunities, but you need that some help to so that the media, independent media, can go from here to there.
And I I hope
That's
all
my
the funders are watching this right now, and everyone sees the opportunity out here. Before we wrap up, we're coming up to an hour now, almost. I just wanted to go around the panel, starting with you, Nic. Since you're in the research business, and actually I want to ask all three of you this. What is the one trend that you think will persist after COVID when it comes to media?
I guess I'll just talk about one thing which we haven't talked about, which is the generational shift that we're seeing right now. So I think that what we see in our data incredibly clearly, people talk about young people, but actually there's a real difference between digital natives, people who grew up with digital, who are sort of under 25, and sort of young millennials who kind of remember old media and a bit nostalgic towards it. But I think we just see such different behaviors there, and sort of many publishers just kind of assuming that they're going to grow into the same behaviors and that they will eventually come to their news apps or websites. And I just don't think that's going to, or start watching television. And I just don't think that's going to happen in the same way. So we need to, as Ying was saying, we really need to think differently about how we take our core and then repackage it in different ways for different audiences, whilst remaining, true to ourselves and our values. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. So it's partly just knowing your audiences better, but it's really knowing that next generation at the same time as continuing to serve the older generation, who are going to be the ones who are going to pay you most of the money in the short term.
Miriam?
Yeah, one mindset we have at Rappler is to not dismiss young people as not interested in news. What we always assume that they are interested in the news, they are interested in information, but we are constantly coming up with different ways of storytelling that would make the news appealing to them. We have a network of campus journalists. We go around campuses and universities, and there are inquiries for internships even from senior high schools. So we see the younger market as a good start to educate them about, to give them like media literacy, because this is the generation who will be consuming the news in the future years, in the future decades. So despite all the attacks, the doubts that the media are receiving now, we have hope in the younger generation who are starting to be introducing to news and who have the right perspective about what real news is, what the real role of the media is. So it will take a lot of work. It will take some years, but I think we've already found where we're going to build the work on. So.
Thank you. And Ying, you get the final word.
Well, thank you. I think the trend towards online will escalate. It would go much faster. And the demise of print will also accelerate. and for the younger generation, there's so much opportunities, and there's so much creativity there. I saw it last year in the protests here, and then so no need to be pessimistic, because this is an opportunity for us, and then for people of all ages to scale up your digital capacity and to keep learning. New tools are developing, they become easier and cheaper, and just do the story, get them out, and keep learning. I think I don't see the structural change yet, but I think it will come. It has to come, so that the industry will take a quantum leap, hopefully, and deliver to what people need.
Very, very wise words. Thank you so much, Ying. Thank you, Nic, and thank you, Miriam. We will see you again soon.
Great, thank you.
Thank
you.
you all.